anyhow, I got this lawyer. I got to New York, and this lawyer took me out to lunch, and we did our business over lunch. And I told him what I had about copyright and so on. And he said, well, you've got a good case there, but I'll tell you what will happen in the States if you try to sue American Express. He said they'll keep dragging in other members of your family to interview back to your great-grandchildren or great-grandparents. And he said, you'll never get any money out of them that way. They can use up all your resources because they're a big company. So he said, what you should do is just take what you can get and run. And so I left it with my Canadian lawyer and my American lawyer, and they got $15,000, which was quite a lot in those days. I think they took 4 between them, and I ended up with 11. In any case, that is how I bought my first press. And then Lauren, who was going to SAIT, was learning about printing at SAIT, I think, as well as journalism. Anyhow, he knew a man at SAIT who was teaching printing, and he learned to run the press. So from then on, we were sort of on our way. But when I started to tell you about the magazine, I didn't get into magazines right away. When I came to Alberta, I got a job first with a temporary, temps. And I realized then that there was no way I was going to get a job because every time I was almost 50 years old. And even when men came in there to get temporary jobs at that time, they'd just put his file down at the side. They wouldn't do anything about them at 40. So I could get a job. So finally, I put an ad in the Calgary Herald saying that I needed a job. I was a writer, I needed a job, and I had a little money to invest. And that little money to invest caught the attention of a man who had a mobile home magazine, and that's how I got into it. And he was always desperate for money, I found out, in the spring and the fall, and I had picked the fall, I think, to advertise. So anyhow, I went to work for Jack, and he wanted to start a second magazine for recreational vehicles. He had mobile homes, we wanted, and that's the one that I started it for him, and I named it Travel Leisure. But then another couple of years went by, and Jack kept getting in the hole with his finances, and so I finally bought the recreational magazine from him. I borrowed money to buy it, I guess. And that's how I got into the magazine business on my own, and got an office in the Herald. And Lauren and I worked from there. But Lauren would stay in the office, and I have to go on the road. Susan took care of the borders, and I went on the road selling advertising. So we were sort of on our way then, except that we were still traveling to Eastern Canada a lot, but I started going by Sudbury more times than through the States in those days, because I had to haul a U-Haul to take magazines down to the shows in Toronto. And we all had a share in doing that. I used to take the magazines to Toronto. Lauren and I, or Lauren and Marvin, would take them to the Vancouver show, and Susan and Jan would take them to the Manitoba shows, and sometimes to Edmonton. So we all did a bit of that, and we got to the stage, we started publishing. Our one magazine was Travel Leisure, and by the way, we had to change that name in order to get my $11,000. I changed the name to Leisure Wheels, and we put out a campground directory, and that was really our bread and butter. Every time we went to these shows, we would, if we sold enough campground directories to pay for our food and our lodging, we thought we were doing well, and we sort of lived off that. And it's led to I think those must have been the most interesting part of our life then, because when the family gets together and starts talking about the past, it's nearly always those trips that we talk about, because there were so many different things happened on them. Susan said, well, Mom, I don't suppose you got a story to tell us about this time. And I said, well, you know, I have. I said, I was debating whether to tell you because I've told you so many stories, but I got caught in a blizzard here. And I had a hard time getting up to Canada, you know. So she said, have you seen American Pie too? She said, there's a girl in that movie that always says, now she tells these stories about her life, you know. She said, I didn't expect you to really have a story. But that was the route that I took most often when I was going on my sales trips, you know. I'd go down from Canada to Minneapolis and then over, and we were retracing it literally. And I'd say, well, you know, I stayed at a hotel there, and this one hotel, you see, in those days, women were not in business. This was a new thing. And they were not used to women coming alone to these hotels. And so the one night, we were driving into Calgary, and we had a little trouble with the car, and we didn't know what was going to happen because the weekend with the motorhome. And I said, well, I'll tell you what happened to me here. I said, I couldn't find a place to stay. And I had tried off the side of it's a toll road, and it was fast, and you couldn't find anywhere there. So I said, I tried several places, and I couldn't. And I came to this Holiday Inn. And I went in, and they wouldn't rent me a room. They thought I was a prostitute, you know, out to make some money, and they wouldn't rent me a room. And I had to leave there. I'll never forgive that woman as long as I live, because she was about my age, and she didn't have any sympathy at all. I had to go to a hotel in Gary, Chicago, which was all black. I was scared stiff. Everywhere I went, there was not a white face amongst them. But they did take me in and give me a room. And then another time on this same trip, I stopped at the Ramada Inn. And I got the room, and I was on the way upstairs. And what is it he said? This young man said, now, if there's any service you need or something, we can supply it. You see, he thought like men all travel. They were looking for a woman, and he thought I was going to be looking for a man. So he said, and that's how different it was in those days. Like, women are on the road all the time now, but never in those days. You didn't see any. And so I ran into all these crazy experiences because I was alone on the road selling, and that just wasn't done. So I had a lot of stories to tell on the way home, and then finally came to the blizzard. But that's the way I went when I traveled. Anyhow, about that time, the boys were the family was growing up, and Lauren had been running the press. Dennis was still teaching in order to have enough money to live on, but he also started working for us at the same time. He would take his weekends to travel around Ontario and sell advertising, and so gradually we were all getting into the business. Susan had graduated from high school, and she had learned to run IBM, is it? Yeah. It was larger than a typewriter, and she could type on it for copy that went into our newspaper, the magazines. Then about 1975, I think it was, Lauren decided to get married, and he went off on a honeymoon to Europe, he and Kathy. And in the meantime, I had managed to get a grant from the Alberta Opportunity Company, and I was able to buy more equipment than we had had before. But the building where we were in Manhattan, I think it's that part of Calgary, Manhattan Street, was going to, they were going to raise the rent. My contract with them was up, and they were going to raise the rent quite appreciably. So I got the idea that we should go out to the country to print. And my cousin phoned and told me that they were selling lots in Irricana for $150 a lot. So that weekend I persuaded Lauren to drive me out here in Irricana. This is where the lots were virtually free. And we drove out to Irricana, and we managed to find the mayor. Irricana looked like nothing you would ever believe, like it had been bombed. There were basement holes all over the main street, because in order to get a $150 lot, you had to dig a basement to prove that you were in earnest about moving in there. So it looked awful, but Lorne said, well, we've driven out here, we better see what we can do. So we hunted up the mayor, and it just happened that Pat was 70 years old and wanted to retire. And before the day was over, I had offered to buy his old garage for $10,000. I didn't have the $10,000. I had $1,000 to put down on it, and I went back to Calgary and raised another loan, and we bought it. And we had hired trucks to move out our press and all our equipment, Susan and I. And Lorne arrived home a few days early, if I remember correctly, and he got home when it was being unloaded. Fortunately for us, because he knew where the best place to put the press and so on. Although, to begin with, we were still trying to put out our magazines, and he had to print in the midst of a pretty rugged looking. We put the press in the welding area where Pat had done his welding, and it was so dirty. Before we actually moved in, no, it was after we moved in, that part we had to use, the boys hosed it over and over and over again with hot solutions. Do you remember doing that? What was, I'm not sure what they used, but they used this hot water sprayed onto these walls, like zeroed right in on the walls. They gradually got most of the grease removed, and then Lorne built a platform over the cement, which a lot of it was broken in the floor of the garage. It was 40 or 60 years old then, I'm not sure which it was. It was an old building. And he built this platform to put the press on, and we got it hooked up to the power and so on. And by the fall, I think we were ready to, we could put out a magazine. But it was the circumstances. I lived with the mice. While the kids went back home to Calgary, I decided that if we had this equipment out here, I didn't want to leave it and have anyone break in and break up my equipment. I'd had such a hard time getting it. So I moved into a room that was at the back of this old garage, and it was full of mice. And I spent that year surrounded by mice. I got so used to it, I just didn't pay any attention. They ran over my face. They were on my bedclothes. They were all over. And I got through that, and everybody came in with different ways of killing off the mice. But we finally, I think maybe they moved out mostly because there was somebody living there more than, because gradually we got rid of them. And the next year, I needed a place to live. We wanted to use the place where I'd been sleeping as a dark room. So Lorne undertook to build a 30 by 30 building at the back. And and I've lived here ever since. He did a very good job. It's a very solid, he didn't know how to build. He'd never built a thing in his life. He just had a book that he was reading out of as he was building. But between him, but every so now and again he'd get to a crucial part and he'd yell for us to come. And Jan was working here then, and Susan, Jan and I think it was, and Paul would be. And he'd yell for help, and we would come and push up the framework that he had got built. He'd build it flat, and then we'd push it into place, and he'd nail it into place, and that would be a wall that we had up, and so on. So we did it bit by bit like that. It was tremendous what Paul and Lorne were able to do to get it built.